When Tong Yishuang walked out of her room after tidying up, her mother was sitting on the sofa, engrossed in watching TV. Seeing Tong Yishuang, her mother immediately found a new target for gossip, chattering away. "Look at Wenyanxi, I just adore him. Handsome, talented, and with such great taste in choosing scripts. I've watched every one of his dramas multiple times." Tong Yishuang turned to glance at the man on the TV screen. Indeed, the phrase, "a dragon among men," was no exaggeration for him. Just standing there, his sharp features and bright eyes could easily captivate anyone. No wonder Wenyanxi had been a sensation for a decade, appealing to all ages. Given the current state of the entertainment industry, it was impressive that someone like Wenyanxi at his age had successfully transitioned from a fresh face to a serious actor, maintaining both skill and popularity. Setting aside other factors, Tong Yishuang had to admit that she admired him. "Mom, weren't you just a fan of Ning Feiyu from that talent show a few days ago? Have you switched idols already?" Tong Yishuang teased as she walked over to the TV and turned it off, causing Wenyanxi's face to disappear from the screen. "I've always liked Wenyanxi, okay? Last month, when he won that Jean Tian award, I was excited the whole night." Her mother pointed at the TV and continued, "He won the award for that spy drama that was just on. I heard the Jean Tian award is the highest honor for TV dramas, right?" Her mother boasted about Wenyanxi with pride, as if she were the one who won the award. Tong Yishuang paused for a moment, then smiled slightly. "You know more about this than I do." Before her mother could continue praising Wenyanxi, Tong Yishuang handed her mother's coat to her and said, "Let's go. Don't you have dinner plans with Annie Dong tonight?" Her mother stood up, reluctant to leave, and said as they walked to the door, Shuang, you're a screenwriter, right? You meet celebrities all the time. Could you get me Wenyanxi's autograph? Maybe next time." Tong Yishuang absent-mindedly replied, having lost count of how many times she had given the same answer. At Linjiangxian restaurant, Tong Yishuang mentioned the reservation for their private room and followed the waiter up to the third floor. Auntie Dong hadn't arrived yet, so Tong Yishuang decided to order the dishes in advance. After the waiter left with the menu, her mother glanced at Tong Yishuang, who was sipping water, and decided to be upfront. Shuang, you know I've been friends with Annie Dong for over 20 years, right?" Tong Yishuang nodded absent-mindedly, opening her phone to scroll through Weibo to pass the time. Her mother, watching her daughter's expression, continued, "So, when I mentioned that you didn't have a boyfriend, Annie Dong said her nephew is also single, and we thought it would be great to introduce you too." She clapped her hands together in excitement. Tong Yishuang paused mid-scroll and turned to frown at her mother. "So today isn't just a reunion with Annie Dong, it's a blind date for me?" Her mother coughed lightly and took a sip of water. "Not exactly, just meeting a new friend. Auntie Dong says her nephew works in the entertainment industry too. Even if it doesn't turn into romance, it's good to have connections." Tong Yishuang sighed, seeing how confident her mother was. She couldn't help but think how crafty people had become these days. Despite not liking her mother's approach, she couldn't just storm out, so she decided to stay with an understanding attitude. Her mother, noticing Tong Yishuang wasn't entirely opposed, felt relieved. Her daughter was stubborn, and it was hard to say where she got it from. At 28 years old with no prospects and refusing to go on blind dates, her mother couldn't help but worry. If it weren't for tricking her into coming today, her mother knew Tong Yishuang would never agree to this. After waiting for about 15 minutes, the door to the private room opened, and Tong Yishuang looked up to see Auntie Dong's friendly smile. Behind her was a tall man wearing a black baseball cap and a matching mask. The man was tall, dressed in a black printed hoodie with a dark brown short jacket over it. Tong Yishuang's first reaction wasn't to find the man's attire odd, but to feel a sense of familiarity, like she had seen him somewhere before. Auntie Dong greeted Tong Yishuang, who had stood up to welcome them, telling her not to be so formal and to sit down. Then she and the man took their seats. Once they were seated, the man removed his hat and mask, revealing his true appearance. Both Tong Yishuang and her mother were stunned. The man was none other than Wenyanxi, the very actor Tong Yishuang's mother had been gushing over just an hour ago. Tong Yishuang thought that her mother would finally stop pestering her for Wenyanxi's autograph now. But Tong Yishuang's mother was clearly more excited than she was. After a moment of shock, her mother's voice began to tremble with excitement, like a teenage fangirl meeting her idol.
"Hello, Auntie.
I'm Wenyanxi." The man's clear voice had a mesmerizing quality to it. Good. Auntie is doing well." Tong Yishuang's mother replied, nudging Tong Yishuang with her elbow. Tong Yishuang finally lifted her head, looking at the man who had captured the hearts of countless fans, and forced a smile. "Hello, I'm Tong Yishuang, a screenwriter." When Yancy smiled slightly, his deep eyes resembling a bottomless well. Tong Yishuang smiled back, but soon admitted defeat, breaking eye contact first. Auntie Dong, watching the harmonious scene, chuckled and said, "Our Yancy's job is unstable, and he's already 30, without a partner. Our Shuang is the same, sometimes going on set for 2 or 3 months without coming home. A screenwriter and an actor, a match made in heaven." "I didn't mention Yancy's job before because I was afraid you'd be put off," Auntie Dong joked with Tong Yishuang's mother. Tong Yishuang's mother was already overjoyed, waving her hand dismissively. "How could I be? I love Yancy's dramas." Well, it hadn't even been 20 minutes, and her mother was already calling him by his first name. Clearly, she was more than satisfied. Tong Yishuang listened to the conversation between the two elders, feeling a bit helpless. For the next half hour, it was mostly her mother and Auntie Dong talking, with every word implying their intention to match the two up, almost as if they were ready to seal the deal on the spot. When Yancy, on the other hand, didn't show any signs of impatience. He responded politely to all of her mother's many questions. In contrast, Tong Yishuang was clearly the least interested of the four, spending most of the time focused on her food, only responding occasionally when directly addressed, and getting pinched on the thigh by her mother several times under the table. Halfway through the meal, Auntie Dong gave her mother a knowing look and said, "Yuhua, why don't you accompany me to pick out some jewelry?" Her mother caught on immediately and said to them, "We'll leave now, you two young people can enjoy yourselves." Tong Yishuang quickly offered, "Mom, let me walk you over, it's late." But her mother firmly pressed her shoulder down. "The mall is right across the street, we'll just walk over. No need to pick me up either, I'll take a cab home." Tong Yishuang awkwardly retracted her hand from her coat, noticing out of the corner of her eye that when Yancy remained calm and composed, showing no emotion. Her mother picked up her bag and, before leaving, smiled brightly at Yancy. "Yancy, do come visit Auntie's home when you have time. I'll make sweet and sour pork for you." "Thank you, Auntie." When Yancy replied with a warm smile, his clear features making her mother even more pleased as she left with Auntie Dong. After watching the two leave the private room, Tong Yishuang finally resigned herself, sitting down with a sigh. Then, she slowly clenched her fists on her lap. When Yancy leaned back in his chair, looking at her across the table, his smile finally fading. After a long silence, he spoke in a deep voice. "It's been a long time, Tong Yishuang." Tong Yishuang wrestled with her thoughts for a while before finally raising her head, lips pursed, and replied with a hint of sarcasm. "No wonder you're the king of drama. You've been acting this whole time." Tong Yishuang looked at Yancy's face, which had remained just as impossibly handsome over the past 10 years. No longer avoiding his gaze, she stared directly at him and said, "I remember when we broke up 5 years ago, I told you that I would find someone 100 times better than you." She paused, her eyes slightly reddened, and continued, "But now, here I am, running into you in a situation like this. Isn't that ironic?" "Tong Yishuang, I wasn't waiting for you," when Yancy said, tugging at the corner of his mouth in a slight smile that, no matter how you looked at it, seemed bitter. When Tong Yishuang heard this, her heart ached uncontrollably. She had been the one who wanted to break up back then, so she knew, of course, that he wouldn't wait for her. Why say this now? Was he afraid she might be deluding herself? Tong Yishuang didn't respond. She knew she wouldn't be able to finish the meal now. She called for the waiter to bring the bill, only to realize that when Yancy had already paid at some point. When Yancy put on his hat and mask again, without even glancing at Tong Yishuang, who stood frozen in place, unsure of what to do, he left the private room. Tong Yishuang was stunned for a moment, but instinctively grabbed her bag and followed after him. As she stepped out of the restaurant, the wind was strong. Tong Yishuang, wearing cropped pants, shivered as the cold seeped up from her feet. When Yancy opened his mouth as if to say something, but in the end, he swallowed the words. The hand hidden in his sleeve slowly clenched into a fist, then loosened in defeat. At this point, the admonitions he once delivered so easily no longer had any grounds or right to be spoken. Tong Yishuang exhaled into her hands, then looked up at Yancy, pretending to be lighthearted. After all these years, I've already moved on from what needed moving on. I wish you success in your career and that you find a beautiful young wife soon." After she finished speaking, Tong Yishuang lowered her head, absent-mindedly kicking a small pebble at her feet. Wen Yanxi's eyes, hidden beneath the brim of his hat, narrowed with cold indifference, and the words he spoke were as chilly as the weather. He said, "Tong Yishuang, do you know what my biggest regret is in my 30 years of life?" Without waiting for her to respond, he continued, "It's meeting you." Despite hearing these words and feeling the urge to turn and leave immediately, Tong Yishuang forced herself to smile and retorted, "But there's no cure for regret, and no matter what, the fact that we were together for 3 years can never be erased." Wen Yanxi laughed coldly at that, then left Tong Yishuang without so much as a goodbye, quickly walking toward the waiting van at the curb. As she watched the van merge into the flow of traffic and disappear from view, Tong Yishuang sniffled, the corners of her mouth slowly curving into a smile. But as she smiled, tears finally welled up in her eyes. She wasn't sad at all, it was just that the wind was too strong. She didn't care for him anymore, she was just reminiscing about her first love. That's what she told herself. Later that night, Tong Yishuang's mother returned home, brimming with excitement. When she saw Tong Yishuang in the kitchen heating up some milk, she asked in surprise, "How did you get home before me?" And judging by her pajamas, it was clear she had been home for a while. According to the plan, shouldn't she have gone to a movie, taken a romantic walk, and then returned home? Tong Yishuang took the milk out of the hot water and took a sip, responding, "You'd be happiest if I didn't come back, wouldn't you?" Her mother immediately moved to her side, asking incredulously, "Don't tell me you didn't even consider Wen Yanxi?" Tong Yishuang blinked, recalling the resolute look on Wen Yanxi's face as he left, and smiled. "He's the one who didn't consider me. Are you saying Wen Yanxi didn't like you? That's impossible. During dinner, I could tell he couldn't take his eyes off you." Tong Yishuang was taken aback. Probably those were looks of resentment. Otherwise, she couldn't imagine Wen Yanxi looking at her with affection. "All right, Mom, let's not talk about Wen Yanxi anymore. There's no way it would work out between us. Given his status in the entertainment industry now, he could have anyone he wants. Why would he be interested in me?" Her mother wasn't pleased to hear this, grumbling. "What's wrong with you? You're a top screenwriter. You've got the looks and the figure. Why wouldn't he be interested?" Hearing this, Tong Yishuang finally felt certain that this was indeed her mother. She playfully pinched her mother's cheek, smiled, and then, carrying her milk, walked lightheartedly toward her room. Before falling asleep, Tong Yishuang, with her eyes closed, drifted into a half-dream state where she finally began to recall fragments of her past with Wen Yanxi. What was Wen Yanxi like at 20? Tong Yishuang couldn't describe it accurately. She only knew that every gesture, every movement, made her heart flutter. He didn't wear white shirts, nor did he play the piano, yet he embodied the essence of a first love. Her own, exclusive first love. That autumn, 10 years ago, Tong Yishuang had proudly become a freshman in the Drama Academy, majoring in scriptwriting. One autumn afternoon, Tong Yishuang stepped out of a McDonald's, holding her phone in one hand and a McFlurry in the other. The man ahead of her had quickly pushed open the glass door and left. Seeing the door about to close, Tong Yishuang hurried forward, intending to use her body to keep it open. At that moment, a pair of black canvas shoes stepped forward in her line of sight, and someone from outside pulled the door open for her. Tong Yishuang looked up to thank the person, but when she saw who it was, she wasn't sure if it was the sun that was too bright, or if he was too dazzling. She felt a bit dizzy. The light filtering through behind him cast a soft glow on his hair, making him seem so gentle. Tong Yishuang was reminded of Zhou Zhang's poem, Desert. "In this barren land, nothing grows. But then you came and passed by. And miraculously, everything flourished. Here, within my heart." Tong Yishuang quickly lowered her head, softly thanked him, and hurried out of the McDonald's. She walked about 5 meters away, dazedly holding her McFlurry, then stopped. She thought about it. She was dressed nicely today, her makeup was well done, and handsome guys like this didn't come around often. So, why not? Tong Yishuang turned back, pushed open the glass door, gave herself a little pep talk, and then joined the line behind the boy. After gathering enough courage, she tugged at his sleeve, her voice soft and sweet. "Hey, could I have your contact information?" The boy turned around, his handsome face first showing a hint of surprise, then slowly breaking into a smile. Tong Yishuang noticed a faint dimple on the left side of his face and felt confident she had won. But after a moment, as he looked at Tong Yishuang's slightly flushed face, his bright red lips lazily formed the words, "No, I can't." Those 4 words shattered the 10 minutes of mental preparation she had built up. In an instant, her face flushed red, and she glared at him with wide eyes, holding back her frustration. After a long pause, Tong Yishuang huffed loudly, and in a fit of confusion, she shoved the half-eaten McFlurry into his arms before stomping out of the McDonald's in a huff. In truth, it wasn't so much anger as it was more a matter of being ashamed and furious. Tong Yishuang's first attempt at flirting in 18 years ended in a spectacularly disastrous way. She swore never to be so smitten with looks again that she'd flirt with a handsome guy, ever. But a week later, when an older student from her hometown pointed out a boy at the cafeteria window, full of admiration, Tong Yishuang learned that the boy she had so boldly flirted with that day was none other than the famous Wen Yanxi from the acting department. The one who had entered the acting department at the top of his class, the teacher's favorite, and the object of affection for countless girls across all departments. In short, Wen Yanxi was probably one of God's favorites, born to excel in acting. Tong Yishuang's days of pent-up frustration suddenly melted away. It was Wen Yanxi, after all. Wasn't it perfectly normal to fail when flirting with Wen Yanxi? She was just one of the many who had fallen on the path of pursuing Wen Yanxi. With this thought in mind, Tong Yishuang happily enjoyed a big meal with 2 extra drumsticks that day. Just when Tong Yishuang thought she would never cross paths with Wen Yanxi again, fate, in its own way, left her a small chance. That day, after lunch, Tong Yishuang went to buy a milk tea. She ordered a matcha tea with milk foam, which didn't really need a straw, but out of habit, she grabbed a thick one anyway. Just as she was about to leave, she heard a clear male voice behind her say, "Could you give me that straw? I bought a bubble tea." Tong Yishuang glanced at the straw holder. What she held was the last straw. She turned around, ready to say, "Sure," with grand generosity, but when she saw it was Wen Yanxi, she swallowed the words right back. Wen Yanxi seemed slightly puzzled at first, then his expression lit up with recognition. His face relaxed into a stunning smile, reminding her of the male lead from the shoujo manga she had been following. Tong Yishuang, reminded of her failed attempt at flirting with him that day, mimicked his style. She leaned lazily against a counter, her red lips parting slightly. "No, I can't." Wen Yanxi raised an eyebrow, the little dimple on his left cheek appearing again. He let out an "oh." Then he leaned closer, and suddenly, Tong Yishuang found herself staring at his chest, so close she could faintly smell the lavender scent of his laundry detergent. She was too scared to move a muscle. Of course, Wen Yanxi didn't do anything to her. He simply reached past her and pulled a straw from the counter. Then he raised his eyebrow, waved it teasingly in front of her, and walked away. Tong Yishuang patted her flushed cheeks, turning to find that the milk tea guy had somehow refilled the straw holder. Her attempt to tease back had ended in her being teased instead. Round 2, Tong Yishuang, KO. After that, Tong Yishuang seemed to bump into Wen Yanxi more and more often. She couldn't understand how others could stake out classrooms and still not see him, yet she'd run into him just by getting water, going to the library, or even heading out for hot pot. The more she saw him, the more she found herself drawn to him. Eventually, she realized she had inevitably joined the ranks of Wen Yanxi's admirers. One evening, on her way back to the dormitory, after bumping into Wen Yanxi for what felt like the nth time, Tong Yishuang, feeling impulsive, stopped him and dragged him to a nearby grove. She asked him, "Aren't you tired of this, being around all day?" For once, Wen Yanxi seemed genuinely puzzled. He shook his head and rubbed his nose. "Running around in my head all day. You may not be tired, but I'm exhausted," Tong Yishuang said. To this day, Tong Yishuang still doesn't understand where she found the courage to say something so cringy. Wen Yanxi leaned against a tree, tilting his head with a smile. "So, what should we do about it?" Tong Yishuang replied, "Why don't you just be with me? It's better to stay by my side than run around in my head." Wen Yanxi, with the same posture and tone as that day, rejected her again, saying, "No, I can't." This time, Tong Yishuang wasn't angry. Instead, she seriously asked, "Why not?" Without waiting for his answer, she continued, "I think I like you the most. Just because you say so?" Wen Yanxi stared into her eyes, his smile fading. His eyes shone brighter than the shimmering lake beside them. "Wen Yanxi, just wait. I'll end your single life," Tong Yishuang declared before running off again. Left behind, Wen Yanxi went from confused to amused. He had been really startled just now, thinking she had discovered that he had been secretly following her lately. Soon enough, Wen Yanxi saw Tong Yishuang's determination in action. One quiet evening, as Wenyensi was listening to music with his headphones on, a classmate from the next dorm barged in, yanked off his headphones, and said, "Hey, Wenyensi, there's a girl downstairs confessing to you." "What does that have to do with me?" Wenyensi, a bit annoyed, grabbed his headphones back, about to put them on again. But then the classmate added, "She's a freshman from the drama department, really cute." At this, Wenyensi hesitated, then quickly got out of bed and headed to the balcony. Sure enough, on the lawn below, a heart-shaped ring of candles was burning. Tong Yishuang was holding a megaphone, shouting, "Wenyensi, are you coming down? I've bribed the dorm manager, so don't expect him to chase me away." This statement caused the guys who had poked their heads out to laugh, with some even teasing her. "If Wenyensi rejects you, you can confess to me. I like you." Wenyensi frowned. Seeing this, his roommate thought he was upset with Tong Yishuang and tried to comfort him. "You'll get used to it. Girls these days are getting bolder by the day." "Shut up," Wenyensi said, unusually sharp, then pressed his lips together and rushed downstairs in his slippers, leaving his bewildered roommate behind. When Tong Yishuang saw Wenyensi coming out of the dorm building, she smiled so widely her eyes curved into crescents. The guys, upon seeing the male lead appear, whistled loudly. Wenyensi walked up to Tong Yishuang, his expression not looking too pleased. "What are you doing?" "Confessing, obviously," Tong Yishuang replied, as if it were the most natural thing in the world. "Turning this into some kind of public spectacle?" Wenyensi's voice carried a hint of unnoticeable anger. Tong Yishuang smiled, then said seriously, "It was just me making a spectacle at first. But now that you're here, it's a two-person show. I'm willing, what about you?" With that one line, Tong Yishuang easily dispelled Wenyensi's irritation. Slowly, his gaze shifted away, and a soft chuckle escaped him. Tong Yishuang tilted her head and asked, "I saw this kind of confession on TV. Has anyone ever confessed to you like this before?" Wenyensi shook his head. "Then I'm the first. I've already embarrassed myself today, so you'd better remember what I'm about to do for the rest of your life, even in the afterlife," Tong Yishuang declared with authority. For once, Wenyensi obediently nodded. Satisfied, Tong Yishuang said, "On TV, the guys always confess with a guitar, but I can't play guitar. I only know how to play the harmonica, and I don't know any love songs. So I'll just play Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star for you." With that, Tong Yishuang pulled out a delicate harmonica from her pocket and, standing right in front of Wenyensi, quietly played the children's tune. Suddenly, the surroundings fell silent. Under the moonlight, Wenyensi stood there, watching Tong Yishuang, as the breeze toyed with her dress and the moonlight danced with her dark hair. After she finished playing, Tong Yishuang pretended to lift her skirt, elegantly curtsying. "All right, let's start dating tomorrow." Wenyensi's dimple deepened as he smiled, raising his hand to ruffle Tong Yishuang's hair. Then they both burst out laughing together, like two fools unaware of the world's troubles. Honestly, even if Tong Yishuang hadn't done all this, he would have found a way to confess to her. That day in the grove, when he said no, it was merely to tease her. He just liked teasing her because she looked so adorably flustered and annoyed. The outcome of that night shocked the onlookers, who had expected another case of unrequited love, only to witness mutual affection. And the lead was none other than Wenyensi, the famously unattainable heartthrob from the drama department. According to one of the boys watching, seeing Wenyensi smile so warmly made him feel like his own springtime had arrived. Wenyensi's newfound relationship meant that many of his fangirls would be heartbroken, creating an opportunity for those who had long lived in his shadow. Wenyensi would always remember how Tong Yishuang looked playing the harmonica that night. And he'd also never forget the dorm manager's stern face as he ordered them to clean up the candle remnants. It was a night as embarrassing as it was happy. Later on, the relationship between Tong Yishuang and Wenyensi, like many campus couples, was both ordinary and unique. At first, Tong Yishuang was relentlessly attacked on the school forum by Wenyensi's countless fangirls. She went from crying in frustration to becoming a fierce warrior, standing by Wenyensi's side against the world. Gradually, everyone realized that Wenyensi was not someone whose heart could be swayed. He only flirted with his girlfriend, and he only protected her. Tong Yishuang found herself in a bittersweet position. But how did their 3-year relationship slowly come to an end? It probably began in their 3rd year, during the filming of a commercial when Wenyensi caught the eye of a well-known industry agent. He debuted in a historical drama, skyrocketing to fame. Wen Yanxi became more and more popular and busier by the day. Busy with filming, busy with events, busy with appeasing his legion of fangirls under the company's orders. Tang Yishuang's rivals in love, who once were just the upper and lower class men at the drama academy and the occasional guy, now expanded to countless fangirls across the region. Wen Yanxi was no longer just hers. He had become the boyfriend, even the husband, of many. The two of them saw each other less and less, and their communication dwindled. When they finally did connect, Wen Yanxi often said he was exhausted, falling asleep just minutes into their calls. At 23, Tang Yishuang was ultimately defeated by overwhelming insecurity and the feeling of being neglected. On the day of her college graduation ceremony, Wen Yanxi promised he would make it back. But even by midnight, Tang Yishuang was still waiting for him. That night, she stayed awake, making a decision she thought would torment her for a lifetime but ultimately happened in an instant. The next day, Wen Yanxi, exhausted, finally found her. But the time he squeezed out of his packed schedule was met with Tang Yishuang's breakup. At first, he thought she was just throwing a childish tantrum until she asked, "Would you give up acting for me?" Wen Yanxi remained silent. Tang Yishuang broke down, crying uncontrollably as she pounded on his chest, saying through her sobs, "I hate you so much. I hate myself. I know I should understand you. This is your dream, your career, but I can't. I really can't." Worn out from crying, Tang Yishuang said, "Wen Yanxi, let me go. Without me, you'll only do better. And I will find someone 100 times better than you." "I will," she insisted, though it was unclear if she was convincing herself or him. That day, Wen Yanxi felt drained, in pain, more than any day spent filming until he was physically spent. But seeing Tang Yishuang in such agony, he ultimately agreed to the breakup. He couldn't be so selfish as to keep her by his side, making her wait for him. After Tang Yishuang cried herself to sleep that night, Wen Yanxi stayed by her side, committing every inch of her appearance to memory. 3 years had passed, and the innocence of their youth was gone, their comings and goings no longer in their control. That night, Tang Yishuang dreamed for a long time. She dreamed of the days before Wen Yanxi was famous, when he held her hand as they walked barefoot in the sea breeze, watching the sunrise and sunset, the sky ablaze with colors. She dreamed of him gently kissing her on a deserted street. In the final scene of the dream, Wen Yanxi smiled, a familiar expression on his face, and said, "Tong Tong, I've been waiting for you for so long." But when she woke up, all that awaited Tang Yishuang was the endless darkness and the youth that could never return. With a bitter smile, Tang Yishuang realized that dreams always work in reverse. She then thought of Zhou Zhang's poem, Desert. "Here is barren, with no life in sight. Later you pass through and suddenly, life flourished miraculously. This is my heart." But this time, the poem needed to be read in reverse. When Tang Yishuang saw the finalized cast list for her new movie, she suddenly looked up and asked the director, "Is Wen Yanxi the second male lead?" Zheng Li nodded and said, "Wen Yanxi needs a film to help him break into the big screen, and this role suits him well." The movie Gray Line was, in the strictest sense, Tang Yishuang's debut work, a project she had conceived and written on her own. It tells the story of a life-and-death struggle between an undercover cop, his informant, and a drug lord. The character Wen Yanxi was cast to play was the movie's main antagonist, a ruthless drug lord whose seemingly inhuman nature undergoes a dramatic reversal at the climax of the story. This character was the one Tang Yishuang had poured the most effort and thought into. Tang Yishuang sighed, then looked up with a faint smile and said, "I believe Wen Yanxi's acting skills can handle this role. Some things cannot be avoided. They must be faced head-on." The day Wen Yanxi joined the crew, it wasn't as awkward as Tang Yishuang had anticipated, with old lovers reuniting and working together. Wen Yanxi treated her just like any other crew member, polite, yet distant. His professional demeanor only made Tang Yishuang feel even more unprofessional and self-conscious. 7 years had passed since Tang Yishuang last saw Wen Yanxi act on set. Back when they were together, Wen Yanxi had secretly taken her to the set, but his agent repeatedly warned him not to get too close. Tang Yishuang had to watch Wen Yanxi at work from afar, under the guise of a fan visit. But now, Tang Yishuang could openly watch Wen Yanxi act, performing in a script she had written. During a break, Wen Yanxi's assistant bought coffee for everyone. Tang Yishuang held the mocha in her hands, noting that it was made with milk but no sugar. She glanced at Wenyansi, who was discussing the script with the director, and felt a twinge of complicated emotions. She didn't believe his assistant would know her preferences. "Are you Tong Tong?" A female voice came from behind her. Tong Yishuang turned around to find Wenyansi's agent, Su Qilali, the same person who had discovered Wenyansi and was well known in the industry. "Hello, I'm the screenwriter of this film, Tong Yishuang," Tong Yishuang said with a slight nod. Su Qilali smiled, and faint crow's feet appeared at the corners of her eyes. She said, "I used to hear Yancy call you Tong Tong all the time. I didn't mean to be presumptuous earlier." Tong Yishuang shook her head, not saying anything in response. Back then, Su Qilali had indirectly played a role in their breakup, as she didn't allow Yancy to reveal he had a girlfriend publicly, considering his career prospects. After Yu and Yancy broke up, his emotional scenes in life-and-death situations became exceptional. It's true, people need to experience something to truly understand the emotions of characters, Su Qilali said, her tone indifferent as she looked at Tong Yishuang.
He always had talent.
"He would have done well even without me," Tong Yishuang replied, her words laced with ambiguity. Su Qilali simply smiled, shook her head, and said nothing more. Later that night, after the shoot wrapped up, Tong Yishuang ran into Yancy in the empty hallway, just after he had removed his makeup. Seeing the dark circles under his eyes and the exhaustion he couldn't hide, Tong Yishuang felt a pang of sympathy. When Yancy glanced at her briefly and walked on without stopping. As they were about to pass each other, Tong Yishuang instinctively reached out and tugged at the hem of his coat. When Yancy stopped and turned to look at her, seeing the coldness in his eyes, Tong Yishuang suddenly felt nervous. After a moment, she let go of his coat and shook her head. Seeing her give up like that, when Yancy felt a surge of anger. He wanted to walk away in frustration, but the person standing before him was someone he had thought about day and night for 5 years. In the end, he couldn't bring himself to leave. When it came to Tong Yishuang, Wenyansi was always like this. Because she was the one in his heart, he couldn't help but secretly give her chance after chance, even though he had no idea if she needed them. "Tong Yishuang, do you always provoke people and then pretend it didn't happen?" When Yancy asked her, Tong Yishuang looked up and met his gaze, and in that instant, she felt as though she was falling into an abyss, just like she did all those years ago. Tong Yishuang opened her mouth, but didn't know what to say. Then, as if remembering something, she hurriedly took off her backpack, unzipped it, and pulled out a box, handing it to him. "This is a steam eye mask. It can help you sleep," Tong Yishuang stammered. When Yancy's long fingers took the box, and as their fingers brushed, Tong Yishuang's heart trembled. "How did you know I've had insomnia for years?" When Yancy's tone carried a mix of self-mockery and indifference. It seemed that the noise from outside had finally subsided. Suddenly, Tong Yishuang asked, "Weren't you not waiting for me?" "Who said I was waiting for you? Then, were you waiting for me or not?" Tong Yishuang pressed, uncharacteristically firm, each word filled with tension. After a long pause, so long that Tong Yishuang was about to retreat, feeling defeated once again by the look in Wenyansi's eyes, he unexpectedly chuckled. With his hands in his pockets, he leaned in close to her, curved his lips into a slight smile, and softly said, "Nope." After speaking, Wenyansi disappeared around the corner of the corridor, leaving Tong Yishuang in stunned disbelief. But this time, his steps seemed much lighter. Left standing there, Tong Yishuang finally processed what had happened. She covered her forehead with one hand, smiling helplessly as she let go of her tightly wounded nerves. "Why are you still so childish?" Tong Yishuang softly murmured, looking towards the corner where he had vanished. The filming of this movie took nearly 3 months, including scenes shot abroad. Li, a rising director from Hong Kong, was obsessively meticulous about every shot. Despite the fact that both the male and female leads, including Wenyansi, were exceptional actors, they still couldn't escape Li's dissatisfaction. For these 3 months, Tong Yishuang was constantly on edge. The film featured many gunfights and combat scenes, and Li, striving for perfection and visual impact, refused to allow stunt doubles, meaning the actors had to perform many difficult stunts themselves. Every time it was Wenyansi's turn, Tong Yishuang's heart would be in her throat until the director finally called cut and Wenyansi safely landed, allowing her to breathe a sigh of relief. But she couldn't deny that watching Wenyansi work reminded her of the overwhelming and uncontrollable feelings she had for him all those years ago. Over these 3 months, the relationship between Wenyansi and Tong Yishuang gradually thawed. They would occasionally chat, though mostly about the script. Under Su Qiala's knowing smile, Tong Yishuang could sense that Wen Yanxi treated her differently from the other crew members. The last scene was a high-speed car chase in Myanmar. Before the shoot, Tong Yishuang couldn't hide her worry as she said, "The director said we could use a stunt double if necessary. You're not a professional, so don't push yourself." At that moment, Wen Yanxi had just finished discussing with a stunt coordinator. Seeing how worried she was, he felt an inexplicable sense of warmth. "I've done all the stunts myself so far. Let's end with a perfect final scene." He then gently patted her head, his expression tender. The director finally called cut, and it was indeed a perfect ending. But the car crash, which was supposed to be a special effect, turned out to be real. The car Wen Yanxi was driving actually flipped twice before landing. Everyone rushed over, and Tong Yishuang's legs trembled as she walked, terrified that something had happened to him. When Wen Yanxi was pulled out from under the car, his face was covered in blood, making it impossible to tell whether it was his or just makeup. However, the fact that he had broken a leg was undeniable. Tong Yishuang pushed through the crowd, her face streaked with tears. She cried as she hit him. "Wen Yanxi, I told you not to push yourself, but you wouldn't listen. What am I supposed to do if something happens to you?" Dazed and somewhat confused, Wen Yanxi was stunned by Tong Yishuang's tearful outburst. Eventually, he gently held her hand, softly reassuring her in a tone that was more tender than he had ever used in all his years of acting. This scene left the entire crew in shock, but it also made everyone understand the relationship between Tong Yishuang and Wen Yanxi. Over the past 3 months, Wen Yanxi's special treatment of the screenwriter finally had an explanation. Wen Yanxi naturally missed the wrap-up celebration of the Grey Informant due to his injury, which would take months to fully heal. The news of Wen Yanxi's dedication and injury stayed on the trending topics for days, earning him a wave of goodwill from the public. Many people expressed that they would go to the cinema to support the movie out of respect for his commitment to the film. That evening, Tong Yishuang prepared a pot of pig's trotter soup and went to the hospital to visit Wen Yanxi. As it happened, he was alone in the room. Tong Yishuang glanced at the single room, which was filled to the brim with flowers, fruits, and gifts from fans. She placed the thermos box on the cabinet with just the right amount of force. She didn't say anything and simply sat down on the sofa not far away. Leaning back against the pillow, Wen Yanxi crossed his arms and watched Tong Yishuang with a faint smile. Feeling uneasy under his gaze, Tong Yishuang huffed softly and looked away, feeling guilty. "Don't tell me you're jealous of my fans," Wen Yanxi teased, amusement evident in his voice. "Your thoughts are so childish," Tong Yishuang denied, unwilling to admit it. "Who's the childish one? I flip a car, and you act like it's life and death, crying over me," Wen Yanxi bluntly pointed out, his tone laced with smugness, far removed from the mature and steady image he usually portrayed on screen. Tong Yishuang felt embarrassed by his words and decided to ignore him. Seeing her familiar look of embarrassed anger, the corners of Wen Yanxi's mouth slowly lifted, then gradually settled back to a calm expression. After a while, Tong Yishuang noticed the silence and finally turned her gaze back to Wen Yanxi. She saw him opening a drawer, taking something out. Focusing her eyes, she realized it was a silver harmonica, and her hands instinctively clenched the hem of her shirt. When the familiar melody of "Twinkle, Twinkle, Little Star" flowed from Wen Yanxi's lips, Tong Yishuang felt as if she had been transported back to a night 8 years ago. The sky was clear, the moon and stars shone brightly, the breeze was gentle, and everything was just right. When the song ended, Wen Yanxi asked her, "Has anyone ever confessed to you like this before?" Tong Yishuang chuckled softly and shook her head. "Then today, you have to remember it for the rest of your life. Even in the afterlife, you can't forget." When Yanxi repeated the words Tong Yishuang had said years ago, his smile faint, without any trace of jest. Tong Yishuang quietly agreed. "Tong Yishuang, if we hadn't broken up back then, it would have been 8 years by now. Even a war ends after 8 years. Shouldn't we also have some sort of ending? All these years, you've had plenty of beautiful women around you. Why wait for me?" Tong Yishuang asked him. When Yanxi smiled slightly, lowered his head, his bangs covering his eyes. "Because many years ago, I met a star. Later, she disappeared, and no matter how hard I searched the universe, I couldn't find another one like her." Tong Yishuang stood up, walked to his bedside, and lightly punched his shoulder, her voice choked with emotion but carrying a hint of bossiness. "Speak human language." When Yanxi lifted his head, gently wiped away the tears at the corner of her eyes with his fingers, and said seriously, "They're not you. I only want you." Tong Yishuang's tears flowed even more. For all these years, hadn't she been waiting for him too, driven by a vague and distant hope? For all these years, she had never dared to watch his films, never dared to follow his news, never dared to click on his trending topics. Because she was afraid that one day, the news would break that he had a girlfriend, that he was getting married. She was afraid that she would never see him again. When Yancy clumsily tried to wipe away her tears, then pulled her into his arms, his voice coaxing and gentle. "Tong, let's get back together, okay?" After a long moment, Tong Yishuang finally calmed down. She sniffed and pushed him away. "You know this movie is my debut?" "I know. Otherwise, he wouldn't have insisted on taking the role despite Su Qiala's objections." "Wen Yancy, let's make a bet. If this movie gets a nomination, we'll get back together." Wen Yancy smiled, his eyes full of helpless affection, and nodded. However, the tender moment was short-lived. Suddenly, Tong Yishuang exclaimed in frustration, "Oh no, I grabbed the wrong thermos before leaving home. No wonder it felt so light." "Tong Yishuang, are you a pig?" Tong Yishuang's bet was that if the movie received a nomination, she would reconcile with Wen Yancy. So when the film garnered 13 nominations at major award ceremonies and when Yancy won Best Supporting Actor at the Golden Statue Awards, Tong Yishuang was utterly stunned. She didn't know whether to cry or laugh. Sitting in front of the computer, Tong Yishuang watched the live broadcast, from the announcement of Wen Yancy winning Best Supporting Actor to him walking up to the stage in a sharp suit, radiant with excitement. Her mind was a blank. As the presenter handed the award to Wen Yancy, he bowed slightly to receive it, then walked to the microphone, raised the heavy trophy, and smiled down at it. That smile was indeed the essence of Wen Yancy. Perhaps too excited or emotional, Wen Yancy took a moment to compose himself before speaking. He began by thanking the director, the crew, and then his parents. Finally, Wen Yancy said something that left everyone, including Tong Yishuang, in shock. He said, "5 years ago, I loved someone, but I pushed her into the crowd because she wanted freedom. But I regretted it for 5 years. For the rest of my life, I want to be selfish, just to be with her." This film is her debut. She promised me that if it received a nomination, she would reconcile with me. But I'm proud to say that I've won an award for her. Then, Wen Yancy turned to the camera, smiling proudly with a serious look in his eyes, and asked Tong Yishuang, "So, can you reward me by marrying me?" After a moment of silence, the applause was thunderous, and the host went on stage to congratulate Wen Yancy. In front of the entire nation and at one of the most significant award ceremonies for an actor, Wen Yancy proposed to Tong Yishuang. The news caused a huge stir, and Wen Yancy topped the trending topics. The announcement was explosive. In 10 years of his career, Wen Yancy had rarely been involved in gossip, let alone rumored to be dating anyone. Now, he had suddenly proposed at an award ceremony. Wen Yancy's usual image was that of a mature and aloof man. This proposal made him the #1 man women wanted to marry. After all, who wouldn't want a devoted partner who had waited for years and a proposal witnessed and blessed by everyone? That evening, Wen Yancy called Tong Yishuang. As soon as she answered, she said, "Wen Yancy, when you see me tomorrow, don't say anything, just pin me against the wall and kiss me, okay?" Wen Yancy was taken aback and replied, "Gladly." A week later, Wen Yancy posted 2 photos of their marriage certificate on Weibo. His post read, "On a beautiful spring day, she and I became a couple for life." The post quickly became trending news again, with friends offering congratulations and loyal fans showing their support. Of course, there were also some extreme fans who expressed their heartbreak and marketing accounts that seized the opportunity to gain attention. But it didn't matter. To Wen Yancy, he accepted all the blessings with a smile and chose to forgive any criticism. As they left the Civil Affairs Bureau, Tong Yishuang beamed as she held the red marriage booklet and looked up at Wen Yancy, who was smiling just as brightly. In the days to come, Tong Yishuang would never speak of leaving again. From yesterday until tomorrow, she was certain that Wen Yancy was the one she wanted to spend her life with. They were no longer young, and there were not many 5 years to waste. After the wedding, fans noticed that Wen Yancy's Weibo had shifted from ads and promotions to ads, promotions, and displaying affection. On a talk show, Wen Yancy, who had been serious about discussing his new film just moments earlier, instantly transformed into a lovesick fool when the host mentioned his wife. Gone was his usual aloof and restrained demeanor, replaced with declarations of how adorable and amazing his wife was, and how much he loved her. When the episode aired, fans left comments like, "Forget everything else. Is anyone organizing a group to sneak into the old one's house tonight to steal his wife?" When Yancy responded, "No, she's mine," his possessiveness was so evident that fans almost wondered if they were following a fake idol. On one occasion, when Yancy was forced by his manager, Qilali, to do a live stream, the entire session was awkward and full of forced conversation. If not for his good looks, it's likely many fans would have angrily turned off their phones. When Tong Yishuang came home and saw Wen Yancy sitting on the couch with a cold expression, she didn't realize he was live streaming. Assuming he was just recording a video, she skipped over and flopped into his arms, cheerfully exclaiming, "Hubby, you're going to be a dad." Wen Yancy froze, overwhelmed with excitement and disbelief. But once he realized the camera was still on, he quickly pressed Tong Yishuang's face against his chest and hurriedly shut off the live stream. So, once again, Wen Yancy shared the news of becoming a father with the entire nation.
Comments.
1. Not fast enough with the screenshots. Couldn't get a shot of Wen Yancy's wife's face. 2. My idol of over a decade is becoming a father. Second heartbreak. 3. Wen Yancy's wife must have saved the galaxy. When Wen Yancy read these comments, Tong Yishuang was already asleep in his arms. He gently stroked her eyes, the same eyes that had captivated him on the day they first met, their spring-like gaze and autumn-like brows making him fall in love over the years. In truth, it was he who had saved the galaxy, finding this most adorable little star amidst the vast universe.